The Great Cold by Frank Belknap Long. The little web-footed man swam slowly through the dark sea. With chest forward and lungs distended, he breasted the wide current, gliding evenly between iridescent jellies and parrot-beaked fish. As he swam, enormous eyes stared at him, and dangling tentacles caressed his limbs. He swam without fear, for he was in a charted area of harmless food-giving plants and animals, and his mission was a pleasant one. Altering his course, he descended in a straight line towards a cluster of spongy shellfish. As he floated gracefully above it, he turned swiftly on his back and thrust downward with his legs. The sharp cutter attached to his heel went deeply into the soft mass. Again and again he thrust. The dislodged mass ascended, and he seized it in his teeth. Turning about in the water, he swam slowly to the surface. The water was black with human heads as he broke the golden surface film. All about him, others of his kind moved swiftly shoreward, with clusters of soft foodstuffs dangling from their thin lips. Far ahead, black rocks towered. Centuries of erosion had worn and compressed them, and the great sun now bathed them in an amber radiance as it declined slowly in a circle of fire. At the base of the mile-high cliffs, the summits of the barnacle masters glistened with the luster as of wind-glazed sandstone. The summits protruded slightly above the water, and luminous shadows moved behind their yawning valves. To the web-footed man, these shadows were more omniscient than the mysterious forces which had created him, for the swollen bodies of the majestic lords of the sea and the enormous complex minds in their capitulums had set stern limits to his willing and relentlessly conditioned behavior. Beside him in the warm sea, another man was swimming. His body was feeble, his mind fearless. In his persistent human way, he strove to pierce the heavy dark veil which concealed the future. As he swam cliffward, he spoke in a sibilant whisper. "Krulon, they intend to shrink us. They have decided that we are less alert than our mates, that our fingers are clumsy, our bodies uncouth. They admire the slim, graceful bodies and agile minds of our mates. To diminish our ugliness, they will shrivel our bodies and minds, as the forces of nature have shriveled the males of their own kind." Krulon shuddered, and a feeling of dread pervaded his little being. He turned slowly upon his back, said, 10 million years ago, Slaw, when the glory of terrestrial dominance enveloped our little race, the tall ones had minute complementary mates. It was always so, and they have grown indifferent to the shame and humiliation. But if they shrink us, our mates will despise us. "This is true, Krulon," agreed Slaw in a grim tone. Slaw, being weak of body, was seldom sent forth on food-gathering missions. As a wise and able servitor of the barnacle masters in the chemical caverns, he was privileged to glimpse the future dimly, to behold, vaguely prefigured, the vast, stupendous dreams of perfection which were continually taking shape in the minds of the crustacean overlords. He knew that the barnacle masters dreamed hideously of world dominion in their white shell towers. For millions of years they had contended with the great land invertebrates for terrestrial supremacy, working secretly with obscure chemicals and vegetable ferments to transform their own bodies and the bodies of their tiny human serfs. Their ultimate aim was the complete destruction of the insect hordes which held the continents in servile bondage. More relentless than the insects, they moved grimly toward appalling ends. Their dream of perfection was immediate, personal. Lacking the selfless minds of the ants and bees, they dreamed of glutinous absorption, of sense-channeled delights. Swaying immense in their tall shells, they sought to surround themselves with purely nutritive pleasures. It was the females who dreamed thus. The little shrunken males were mere complimentary mockeries which scuttled ignominiously about in the vicinity of their mates. The sense of contempt tinged with mockery, which the female barnacles experienced in the presence of their complements, flowed outward and enveloped their little human servitors. With a kind of malignant cosmic irony, they dreamed of restoring the balance in a lowly sphere of being by making the woman of the human race as relatively enormous as themselves, and reducing the male to physical and mental insignificance. It was an utterly malicious dream, evoked by enforced idleness, the product of immense power seeking to sate itself in trivial cruelties. The two little swimmers were now abreast of the great circular summit of the barnacle shells. Seizing hold of a ladder-shaped polyp, they ascended the rounded eminence, and flicked the water from their bodies. The surface which supported them was vibrant with the slow, rhythmic movements of the barnacle masters in their sea-immersed houses. Through tiny slits in the summits of the domed shells, they could glimpse the great forms within as they floated upright in slothful majesty. Clulon sighed in bitter foreboding, gazed downward and outward at the jasper sea beneath and the tiny human forms that flecked it. Thousands of little figures were disporting themselves in the cliffward curving swells, some still diving for foodstuffs, and others merely swimming for recreation. Clulon looked at Slaw. "Will you return at once to the laboratories?" he asked. Slaw nodded. "Yes, Clulon, all is in readiness there. The new glandular secretion will be poured from its immense vat before the sun grows bright again." Clulon's face was taut with apprehension. "And it is this gland substance which they will inject into our veins, to shrivel and perhaps destroy us." "Yes," assented Slaw. "They have wrought such incredible technical miracles in the last sun cycle, Clulon, that they are mad with impatience to release their slumbering creativeness on someone or something. In another cycle they will subdue the continents as they have subdued the sea, but they are still unprepared for that awful and titanic conflict. The hive and tunnel hordes are still too wary, too powerful. But the chemical caverns hold much that is terrible even now, immense troughs of corrosive plants, body-transforming chemicals. In another cycle they will enwrap the terrestrial sphere in flame and carnage." A shudder convulsed Clulon's small body. He looked downward through a dark, sun-baked slit in the shell at the wavering bulk beneath. It seemed almost unbelievable to him that a form so majestic and omniscient could harbor such malice. Awe and adoration contended with rebellious resentment in his mind. If they did that to him, could he still loyally serve them? Slaw said, "I must go now, Clulon. Perhaps they will pity us in the end. All of us who have selflessly served will prostrate ourselves in humble supplication when the great vat turns and the gland substance streams forth. We will plead for you and for ourselves, but chiefly for you who swim in the depths and have mates who love you. We are feeble of body, and if they shrink us," he shrugged, "it will not matter so much." He turned then and moved swiftly towards a round dark aperture in the cliff wall. Hundreds of similar vents dotted the immense stone surface behind the summits of the barnacle shells, some leading to the laboratory caverns in the sunless depths of subterranean arteries cut in the cliff's spacious interior, others to dark food chambers where the garnerings of the little servitors rested in frigid containers against moisture-dripping walls. Still other apertures led to the rectangular dwelling chambers of the servitors and their mates. In pitying sorrow, Clulon watched the stooped and emaciated form of the laboratory worker advance toward the vent and disappear. He sighed, took one last somber look at the sun-reddened sea far beneath, and walked swiftly toward the only aperture which led to peace and serenity and a momentary forgetfulness in the blue depths of the tall cliff. He walked slowly along a low, damp passage, stooping from time to time to avoid grazing his scalp against low-hanging stalactites and sharp projections in the solid rock. For an interminable distance he repeated these stoopings, passing farther and farther into the cliff, his little human mind shedding its grim fears and growing more serene as he advanced. Presently light burst upon his vision, and he emerged into a rectangular chamber with burnished stone walls and a sloping floor of veined feldspar. As he emerged from the tunnel, a slim white form arose from a recumbent position and advanced toward him. She was a creature of unusual loveliness, with large dark eyes and wondrously curving lashes. Her pale skin and long silvery hair, which descended fanwise to her waist, endowed her with an elusive, almost ghostly beauty as she stood waiting expectantly in the center of the chamber. With joyful exclamation he advanced and clasped her. Her lips softly caressed his bearded face as he pressed her to him. Gently he twined his fingers in her hair and turned them slowly about, inflicting a slight tender pain. For an instant their cheeks met in sudden ecstasy. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he released her. She stood looking at him with glowing eyes. "You look tired," she murmured, "my sweet little one." It was a term of endearment which she had used 1,000 times in the course of their life together. But now the adjective sent a cold chill to the core of his being. He trembled, turned pale. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Why, what is the matter, my little one?" He uttered a muffled groan and stopped her mouth with his hand. Then he led her firmly to a repose slab in the wall and settled down beside her. Her eyes met his with a troubled stare. "What is it, Clulon?" she pleaded. "I await the truth without fear. Have you met someone who—" Clulon shook his head, ran his palm tenderly over her cheeks and forehead. "There will never be another," he said. "You know that, Moutal. We are one body, one mind, forever." "Then what is it?" "I swam shoreward with the laboratory worker Slaw. He knows many things which have been concealed from the food-gatherers. The tall ones intend to—" He bit his lips. "Yes, Clulon?" "They intend to shrink us." Horror flared in the woman's eyes. She sat bolt upright in tremulous apprehension. "You mean they will shrivel our bodies, Clulon?" "They will not shrivel your body, Moutal," replied Clulon. "They will shrivel mine. They have found no adequate outlet for their immense energies which consume them. They are too feeble as yet to wage war on the tunnel and hive hordes, but they can amuse themselves by tormenting us. The pitiful smallness of their own mates has taught them contempt for all males. We are ridiculous in their sight, and they intend to torture and humiliate us." The woman's lips were trembling. "But can they do it, Clulon? Have they discovered a way?" "They can easily alter our bodies, Moutal," said the little food-gatherer. "1,000,000 years ago we had no webs between our toes. In the dim ages of the comet's dust, when changes in the Earth's atmosphere immeasurably aided their development, and the development of the tunnel hordes, and our little kind nearly perished beneath the weight of the Antarctic glaciations, there were no web-footed men. The men who now serve the tunnel and hive hordes are not web-footed. In their deep, dark tunnels, they walk with primitive toes." Then the tall ones injected glandular secretions from web-footed mammals into the veins of our ancestors, and by slow stages we developed these hideous appendages. There is still something in us, a deeply buried instinctive loathing, which will not down. That is why we experience shame when we gaze upon our feet, which are so abnormal, so monstrous. He made a curious sobbing sound in his throat. "Our feet are ugly, but more hideous still will be this new change, which will destroy what we treasure most, the tie that unites us, the sense of wonder and release which we experience when we are together. You will despise me, Moutal." "If they shrivel your body, Clulon," said Moutal in a grim, tortured tone, "I will swim deeply into the water and die. I will never—" her speech was arrested by a sudden flare of prismatic light. Clulon's gaze leaped upward. The circular visual transmitter in the chamber's roof was streaked with rapidly alternating banners of green and orange light. Across its glazed surface, the signals wavered in ominous sequence. Moutal gripped her mate's wrist with her thin fingers, sinking her nails into his flesh till he cried out in pain. "Clulon," she murmured, "it is for you, your colors. One of the tall ones has gone mad." The blood drained from the little food-gatherer's face as he stared. More terrible than any threat of shrinkage was the task to which he had been summoned, the hideous ordeal beneath the sea, which would tax his energies beyond endurance and perhaps destroy him. With a choking cry, Moutal seized his head and drew it to her bosom. Tenderly she wept over him, swaying as she gazed deep into his tortured eyes. She was familiar with the grim menace that lurked in the depths of the tall barnacle shell, and as her terrified mind envisioned the nerve-wracking descent to the poisoned capitulum and the glaring mania in the eyes of the afflicted tall one, she clutched Clulon more firmly and refused to release him. Wallowing in their tall houses, the female barnacles were not immune to disease. Weakened by slothful living and the slaking of pernicious emotional urges, the huge, complicated minds in their capitulums occasionally cracked beneath the strain. So horrible was the ensuing disharmony that the mad forms became a menace to the entire community, which only the little human servitors could surmount. So tiny that they could slip with ease between the deadly lashing tentacles of the mad ones, they were privileged to attack the great bodies with poisoned cutters, becoming for a moment in that strange reversion of function more powerful than the Titan shapes they served. But the penalty of that brief usurpation of power was usually an appalling one, death lurking in every flick of the wildly weaving tentacles. Gently, but with grim tenacity, Clulon untwined Moutal's arms and drew himself up. His eyes were aglow with social consecration, and the horrible caprices of the barnacles, their cold and arbitrary cruelties, were for an instant forgotten. Once in a sun cycle, a barnacle went mad, and once in 20 sun cycles, one of the little food-gatherers was summoned by the visual transmitter to contend with that awful horror in the depths. The task fell alternately on laboratory workers, valve tenders, storehouse guards, and food-gatherers. But it was now the food-gatherers' turn, and among 100,000 potential saviors, Clulon was the elected one. The tiny, consecrated purger of the community of barnacles, more powerful and omniscient in this little hour of dedication than the 20,000 tall ones who majestically, in their fathom-deep houses, usurped the continental coast. Moutal cried out to him in hysterical dismay, and attempted to restrain him as he moved toward the tunnel entrance by twining her arms about his legs. Tenderly, but with firmness, he released himself, pressed his nose to her forehead, and stepped into the tunnel. Swiftly he sped along it, dodging the stalactites with agile dexterity. As he neared the cliff opening, a shrill ululation impinged on his hearing and grew quickly louder as he pounded onward. It was a grimly ominous sound, and in his haste to emerge, he nearly stumbled on the slippery stones beneath. His heart was thudding furiously, and his breath came in spasmodic jerks. There were no longer any tiny human swimmers in the cliffward's surging waves when he emerged and descended with incredible speed to the nearest domed shell. He stood for an instant on the summit of the dome, staring downward at the immense stretch of glistening water beneath him. The sun was very low now, and the waves were the hue of the blood in his veins. A few gulls skimmed the unruffled surface far out, swooping, shrieking. To steady himself, he gazed at the immense purplish arc of the heavens. His swift visual appraisement had imbued him with a sickening vertigo, a diffuse and queer kind of agony. It was as though a sharp cutter had rasped the edges of every nerve in his body. Directly beneath him, about the sea-laved circumference of the great shell, the water was black with the dead of his kind. thousands of little men and women floating there in the churning current. The great barnacle, in its madness, had sucked in all of the happy swimmers and spewed them forth with delirious rage. It was the barnacle directly beneath him which had gone mad. Through the long cracks in the shell's summit he caught furtive glimpses of something huge and wet, moving loathsomely about with an unnatural animation, and as he stared, the ululation arose suddenly to intensify his terror, swelling till it deafened him, and then subsiding and rising again. And when it fell to a thin, hideous wailing, a churning sound from below usurped its function, and Clulon knew that the bodies of the crushed and mangled swimmers were flowing once more into the deep shell, drawn inward in the wake of a relentless suction. A hand fastened on Clulon's shoulder. He turned about in swift affright. Then, slowly, the startled look faded from his countenance. "Come with me quickly, Clulon," said the little laboratory worker. He was standing shivering on the dome, his thin body bent cliffward in urgent entreaty. Without a word, Clulon followed him. They entered the laboratory aperture and passed swiftly between the long tiers of low-hanging stalactites. Presently the passage widened, and they emerged into a cavern so enormous that its sloping roof was lost in swirling vapors 500 feet above their heads. In grim awe, Clulon followed his guide across the great chamber, passing unbelievable marvels as he progressed, enormous metallic vats 100 feet in height, with luminous dials and slowly revolving crystal wheels, shining and flashing in the half-light, translucent spore-breeding cylinders filled with many-hued growths so brilliant in hue that they cast a spell upon his senses, causing his eyes to smart and his brain to reel with a sick revulsion. Cyclopean tiers of loathsome fungus tubes, containing in their blue-lighted interior growths more malignant than the virulent plants of the ant hordes. 1,000 contrivances and repositories, cyclopean and hideous, glowing with technical menace. The fruit of millenniums of experimentation in the depths of the tall cliff. Clulon followed Slaw to the base of a thin inverted funnel of startling transparency which arose from a square elevated base and spiraled upward in the uncertain light till it was lost in the mists above. Behind the bright surface, a dark liquid rose and fell in the center of the funnel. Slaw swiftly thrust out his little hand and turned a metallic control mechanism at the base of the structure. The darkness deep within seemed to deepen and settle down in circular folds. The laboratory worker said, "Give me your cutters, Clulon." Clulon sat down and drew the cutters from his heel. He handed the sharp implements to Slaw without a word. The muscles in his jaw were twitching. Slaw held the cutters firmly and advanced upon the funnel. With steady aim, he hurled both cutters directly at the dark fluid. There was a tinkling murmur as of little bells a-jangle as the thin protective coating tore across. The cutters were enveloped by the dark fluid. For an instant, Slaw stood in silence, waiting for them to grow cold with the frigidity that was beyond anything known to his little race in the days of its supremacy. Presently, from his loose body covering of translucent shell, Slaw drew a thin, sharp metallic instrument and 2 soft pads of cold-resisting ditunite. Stooping, he enwrapped Clulon's little webbed feet in the pads. Then he drew forth a pair of ditunite hand coverings and twined them about his fingers. Holding the thin instrument securely, he stepped forward, pierced the transparent surface skin of the funnel, and drew out the 2 cutters. He slipped them quickly and securely over Clulon's ditunite-encased heels. "We must hurry," he whispered in a tense tone. The 2 tiny forms moved rapidly across the chamber. As Clulon's feet glided over the floor, there arose a low hissing sound, and a thin blue vapor curled upward and enveloped his little person. "If the cutters touch your flesh, you will die in agony," warned Slaw. They passed between towering vats and tubes and horizontal discs, slowly revolving. A look of terror was stenciled on Clulon's countenance as he progressed. He looked fearfully upward at the most menacing of the enormous vats, a rectangular bulk with burnished surface, flecked with immense luminous eyes that seemed to glare malignly down at him in the gloom. He sensed, however, that the eyes were in reality pouring vents through which the interior substance would descend in glutinous streams when the great lever at the base of the container moved downward. "The gland vat?" he asked, clutching Slaw's arm and pointing. His voice was tremulous with foreboding. "No," said Slaw, "the gland vat is over there." He turned slightly and gestured towards the shadow behind him. "But what is that, then?" "The great cold is resting there," replied Slaw in a grim tone. Clulon was near the dark inner entrance of the cliff-piercing tunnel, but at Slaw's words he stopped abruptly, as though the cold in the cutters had penetrated his body, his mind. The great cold, rumors, legends of it, had penetrated even into the little abode chambers of the food-gatherers in the cliffs. "It would freeze all the seas between the continents," murmured Clulon, parroting statements he had heard, as his own ancestors had once mechanically repeated the names of mighty deities without form or substance as they squatted in terror on lonely, fire-etched hills in the early Pleistocene dawn. "It would destroy all life in the oceans. It would shrivel and kill every living thing." Slaw was gripping his arm, urging him onward. "We must hurry," he entreated. Clulon shivered, threw off with an effort his panicky inertia. He passed into the tunnel and sped swiftly along it. Slaw followed, murmuring feverish advice in his thin, tremulous voice. "When you strike, thrust deeply. Avoid the soft parts. Strike directly at the base of the capitulum." The hideous ululations of the mad barnacle increased ominously in volume as they neared the outer world. Clulon was the first to emerge. He ran swiftly along a sloping ledge of rock on the cliff's face and leaped downward to the rounded summit of the great shell. Slaw followed. For an instant the two little figures swayed unsteadily in the twilight. Then Clulon raised his palm and pressed it to the other's forehead in comradely salute. "Farewell, Slaw," he said. "You have been a loyal and a generous friend." Speedily he divested himself of his outer body covering of translucent shell. His little frame gleamed ruddily as he stood for an instant on the extremity of the sloping summit. "Strike boldly and avoid the lashing tentacles," warned Slaw with tears in his voice. Grimly, Clulon nodded. Raising his arms, he leaped vigorously outward and descended in a swift, graceful arc into the darkling water beneath. His tiny body cleaved the surface film and descended deeply. The water was no longer warm. As he righted himself in the purple depths, something cold and rigid collided with his extremities. For an instant he stared through a wavering film into white, sightless eyes set in a pain-racked countenance. Tiny luminous crustaceans had clustered thickly about the hair of the submerged corpse, casting a ghostly radiance on its swollen features. With reluctance, Clulon raised his leg and lashed at the gruesome obstruction with the cutter attached to his heel. The dead man divided as the cutter pierced him. The awful cold seared his flesh in an instant, and his body fell apart and descended in two fragments. Clulon knew then that he was armed with a technical weapon more deadly and effective than death ray or fungus spore, and a renewed confidence surged up within him. He swam slowly toward the towering shell. The water grew brighter as he drew near to it, and presently, through a murky film, he saw the square mouth of a fathom-deep valve. His little countenance set in tense lines as he turned slowly about far under the sea and swam with even strokes toward the immense mad shape in the interior of the shell. The water within was a churning maelstrom. As he passed through the valve, an ascending current caught him up and drew him swiftly in the direction of the demented tall one's great crested capitulum. The capitulum quivered with purblind squirmings and lashings, and the attached elastic peduncle, 100 feet in width, was distended in fury. nearer and nearer to the great form he swirled. 2 long tentacular legs ascended from their rigid sheaths and shot towards him. He turned swiftly and lashed at them with his feet. One divided and fell away in the depths. The other knotted itself in swift menace. He plunged frantically downward as the circle of death shot past him, missing his little form by the fraction of a foot. He turned over and over in the water. The current carried him swiftly upward again in a straight line toward the barnacle's capitulum. 100 feet it towered in the dark brine, its hooded summit glued to the great shell far above, its blood-red lower segments quivering menacingly in the tides. It swelled as he shot toward it. Straight into it he plunged, keeping his little body poised with swift and frenzied arm lashings and manipulating the cutters with deadly accuracy. Twice the unearthly cold seared the great form's swollen bulk as Clulon's heels cut across it. For an instant the little food-gatherer swirled about in the unimpeded current. Then 2 more tentacles arose, churning the dark water as they darted toward him. He plunged between their noose-like coils and returned to the swollen head. Again and again he jabbed at it with his heels. The entire capitulum quivered as the cutters pierced it. Then, horribly, the lower segments divided and fell away, descending into the black depths beneath. Quivering downward, they sank, carrying their hideous seeds of madness, until nothing remained of the great shape but a drained and empty hood that swayed sluggishly in the tides. Relief and joy flooded Clulon's tiny being. He turned exultantly about in the darkness and swam with robust strokes to the surface of the water. As he emerged beneath the dome, a small black shape scuttled quickly toward him. From its lair beneath the summit of the great shell, the little male barnacle had watched the glare slowly fade from the hood of its mate, had heard the frenzied ululations diminish and subside. It hung suspended from a rock ledge immediately above the swimming form of the little food-gatherer and watched him intently as he cleaved the black water. The kind of bestial joy, degraded and mirthless, was stamped on every lineament of its small, wrinkled head. As Clulon floundered, it stretched forth a thin leg and lifted him from the water. Setting him firmly on the ledge, it retreated a pace with a shrill cry. Clulon knew then that he was safe, that the little form would not harm him. In its degenerate, nearly mindless fashion, it was convulsed with gratitude. As Clulon rested on the ledge, staring at the little creature's joy-contorted head, his exultation vanished, and a great wave of horror and loathing flooded his being. He remembered, he understood. With relentless clarity, the menace that overhung the males of his own little race returned hideously to his mind, and assumed a sickening imminence. He had contended in vain in the dark water. His reward would be eternal shame and ignominy, and there could be no peace for him beneath the glimmering constellations. The little barnacle felt no sorrow. It was consumed with a cold and hellish joy, a degenerate gratitude. Its long bondage was over. It was free now to starve slowly beside its slain mate, and even the wet rot which would soon consume its shriveled body segments would be less difficult to bear than the shame it had endured in life. It was to Clulon's credit that he was incapable of self-deception. He perceived with realistic clarity that he would hate his dear little one with a consuming hate if they shriveled him, and when she died, his brain grew cold with the horror of the image that loomed. He got up, stared for an instant at the little barnacle with a consuming pity. Then he turned and ascended swiftly to the surface of the dome. Dexterously, he heaved himself up over wet and glistening rock projections and emerged through a crevice on the surface of the great shell. Hundreds of tiny white forms came flocking about him with joyous cries. Foremost in the throng was his little mate, and as his gaze enveloped her, a brief, fierce joy surged up in him again. He took her with avid huggings to his bosom. The encircling men and women prostrated themselves before him, clung to his wet legs, embraced his shoulders with worshipful cries. It was his little hour of victory. For a brief moment, Clulon towered godlike beneath the gleaming net of stars that spanned the luminous skyway above him. Slaw touched his arm, whispered in awe. A moment such as this is worth all the years of tedious striving, Clulon. All these people would die for you in an instant. They would hurl themselves into the waves below at your command. It is the intoxication of power, Clulon, the intoxication of glory. Your heroism flows out to them. They identify themselves with you, share in your triumphs. As I stand here beside you, I can feel the current flowing outward. It envelops me, and I share in the glory and power. Great deeds ennoble, Clulon. They seem to exist in themselves as sentient realities, and when their aura descends upon us, we become transfigured, transformed. Are you not proud, Clulon? Gently, Clulon set Mutal down, turned about till he was staring directly into the worshipful eyes of the little laboratory worker. I am not proud, Slaw. I am ashamed. Ashamed. We are the heirs of a mean destiny. Yet if I should dare boldly now— Madly, the little fingers continued to press about him, shouting, chanting, extolling his heroism in a frenzy of adoration. He swayed for an instant in the press, holding Mutal grimly to him with his vigorous right arm, as though reluctant to relinquish her precious, slender form, to relinquish all the sweetness and wonder that had sustained his little life for so long. Mutal murmured, You are tired, my dear little one. Let us go quickly into the rock. Clulon drew her swiftly to him, welded his countenance to hers. For an instant, tears stung his eyelids. Then he freed himself, stood erect. Come, he shouted. The throng divided in wonder as he advanced across the domed shell and entered the laboratory vent. In the dark entrance, he paused an instant, raised his hand in fervent appeal. Follow me, he cried. Down the wide tunnel he sped. Beneath the uneven stone roof his little form leaped forward, with chest outthrust and head thrown back in exultant triumph. A sense of godlike power flooded his midget being. 5,000 of his kind followed swiftly at his heels. Slaw ran beside him, clutching at his arm in sudden apprehension. Go with Mutal into the rock, he panted. You are tired, distraught. You are violating the sanctity of the cavern. Give heed to me, Clulon. You are courting disaster. But Clulon was deaf to advice. He sped onward, turning from time to beckon and shout. And presently he was in the great cavern itself, and the little forms that obeyed him blindly were all about him, awaiting his commands. With a kind of oracular majesty, he flung up his arm and pointed into the shadows toward the towering receptacle of the great cold. Climb up, all of you! Pull down the lever! Exclamations of terror and amazement burst from the throats of the little servitors who adored him. Some fell prone in supplication and entreaty, torn between reluctance and desire. Others turned and fled with paling cheeks, but the majority obeyed his grim command. They ascended, with shrill cries, clustering upon the immense metallic lever till it was completely covered with their small white bodies. For a moment, the midget shapes twisted and turned in the dim, blue-lighted cavern, high in the air above Clulon's swaying form. Then slowly, terribly, the squirming human mass descended, and the great vat turned. As the lever moved downward, the vat slanted, and the luminous eyes far above opened automatically in its cyclopean bulk. The glow vanished, and the dark opacity usurped the pouring vents, and, enwrapped in the white flame of a superhuman daring, Clulon gazed swiftly about him. He was not alone on the ground. Several of the little men and women had ignored his command, and were standing entwined in one another's arms, oblivious of the horror that loomed. As his gaze swept about the unheeding forms, all the exultation and power seemed to ebb from him, to flow away in a dark, remorseless tide. He swayed backward in mute agony. As he did so, a slender woman emerged from the shadows and ran swiftly toward him. Encircling him with her arms, she pressed her cheek fervently to his, and stared fearlessly upward. Her silver hair descended fan-wise to her waist, giving her a spectral look in the vast dim cavern. From somewhere near at hand, the voice of the little laboratory worker said, "Farewell, Clulon. Death is a dark, bitter fruit. But the core is luminous, Clulon. When the rind is gone, all the darkness will vanish forever." Clulon felt suddenly godlike again, and wrapped in a sustaining aura of love and friendship, he stared upward with unwavering vision into the dark dropping face of the great cold. "You are wrong, Slaw," he said quietly. "The entire fruit is luminous now." As he spoke, the great cold descended upon him in a black engulfing wave, and spread slowly outward, ending forever his rebellious human dream and the long bright noon of the barnacle.